As I was preparing for this sermon this morning, I was trying to think of the example that had the most impact on me. So if this example doesn't work for you this morning, know that it's the one that I thought for me that had the most impact, and I'll explain why. Now, in the 80s and 90s, one of the most formidable boxers of all time was this fearsome Iron Mike Tyson. Now, Iron Mike was known because he was ferocious and vicious, and if you've ever seen him in person, it's terrifying. But what I really want to talk about is actually one of these events that happened and how it played out. So there was an event that occurred where many reporters came up to him just before the fight, and they were telling Iron Mike, this opponent that you have, he's so big, he's so strong. He has all these special abilities, he has all this footwork, that his style is so unique. And they asked Mike, how are you going to combat all of these things? And Mike Tyson says in my mind, one of the most memorable quotes of all time, that everybody has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. Now, I'm not advocating for violence, or I'm not advocating for fighting. What I'm trying to show you here is the statement I think has value in everyday life. What he says here is not just about boxing. What he says here actually is something about how do we as people deal with adversity. That sometimes we all have these grand plans and hopes, and sometimes something happens. We get a dose of reality. Challenges occur, and then we crumble. And I think that for all of us as Christians, this happens at one time or another in our faith, that we had a slap of reality that happens when we're so excited for the gospel, so excited for ministry, so excited for missional living, that the mere fact that this reality hit us, that something turned or changed, really completely flattened us as the people of God. If this is something that you've faced in your own life as Christians, then I think this account today in Acts will remind you that this is an expectation that we should have as Christians. That the Christian life or missional living is not much like an arrow that's shot straight, unimpeded, but rather the Christian life is actually much like a roller coaster, where it has turns, it has ups, it has downs, it has twists. And that as Christians, we should anticipate this as part of the journey of the Christian life, as part of missional living. And we need to be wise for the ride. So I'm going to repeat that again. Being missional is sometimes like a roller coaster. That means that there'll be turns, there'll be ups and downs. But as Christians, we should know that this is all part of the journey, and that we need to be wise for the ride. Now, if you recall last week, Pastor Kevin spoke about this Macedonian call. And the call goes like this from Acts chapter 16, verses 9 and 10. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now, in the beginning of this text, we actually see them land in this region or place of Philippi. And Philippi is the southeastern kind of most state or region in Macedonia. Now, the Philippian people actually were very proud to be Romans. They had this history where the place was conquered, a major battle had taken place in this area, and it really has driven kind of the fervor of these Romans to really appreciate being Romans in this area. They loved their Roman heritage, and they enjoyed many special benefits because of this region, because of its history. These are people that truly loved their city. Now, as the disciples are kind of entering into Philippi, their first encounter is with this group of women by water that's near the city on the Sabbath. And these women are praying on the Sabbath. Now, this is likely not an impromptu prayer service. Rather, this would be the local synagogue that is meeting by this body of water. Now, according to Jewish custom, you actually need 10 men to actually form an official synagogue. However, in Philippi, there actually was a very small Jewish community, so they actually did not have enough people to meet this requirement, as we can see from the people that were meeting here by the river. So at this point, it's customary that if there is no official synagogue, these Jewish people, these people who worship God in the Jewish faith, were allowed to pray and worship by a body of water. Now, if you've been following us in the book of Acts, you know that this is part of Paul's normative process of preaching the gospel. He would often go to the local synagogue, and he would first preach the gospel to the local Jewish people. And that's what we see here. We see that Paul goes to the local congregation and explains the scriptures to these women who have gathered here to meet and to worship. Now, this account makes it seem like it's a one-time thing, so it's almost like, we'd gone to a lake, I met you there, you were converted. However, in the actual Greek, it actually makes it very clear this is not just a one-time thing that they'd met up, but they had met up multiple times, over and over again. And finally, these women came to faith. And one of the women who had come to faith, which the story here points forward to, is Lydia. And Lydia is a Gentile, one who is a worshiper of God of Israel. We're also told that she's quite well off, as she's a seller of fine purple cloth. But she's singled out here kind of oddly. And we're going to talk a little bit about why she's singled out here a little bit oddly later. But the thing we should remember here about this ministry is the first attempt that they make, their first intentional attempt here at preaching the gospel, seems to go quite successfully. Agreed? It goes well. People come to faith. However, after this event, the story takes this weird turn. Because after this, it tells us that they started to go prayer again, likely to go see the women again. However, over and over again, they are pestered by this girl who is possessed by a spirit. As it says in verse 17 and 18, she followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And this she kept doing for many days. Now, there are a number of reasons why that Paul could have been annoyed at this. Firstly, she could be making this statement as a way to kind of mask the truth a little bit. Philippi is actually a region which practices syncretism. There are lots of different gods in this region. So for her to say that he is the Most High God, she might be saying here that he is a God among gods. So number one, Paul might be annoyed because she might be kind of coloring what Jewish people actually believe in their monotheism. Could also be secondly, which I think is probably more probable, is that these things she might be saying ironically or kind of in jest or as a joke, right? That these people are worshipers of God, almost as if to mock them, to make fun of them. Now, whatever the reason might be, the text tells us that Paul here was quite annoyed by this. And then ultimately, he casts out the spirit that is in her. Now, her master also clearly didn't seem to believe her, right? So this is kind of what leads us to think that there's something going on here, because he then takes he takes these disciples and brings them before the magistrate, because he's just lost a major money source, a major income source. And he takes them to the magistrate, and he says to the magistrate, "These men are Jews and are disturbing our city. They advocate for customs that are unlawful for us, Romans, to accept or practice." Now, this charge is a little bit odd, and we're not quite sure exactly how this charge fits what's happening, but our best guess is that when Paul and Silas and the others had removed this spirit from this girl, they'd taken away an income source and therefore hurt part of the economy of this person. And so it's actually seen that this religion seems to be one that is causing a fuss, one that is kind of riling or changing things. And this is actually quite destructive. And one of the rules among this idea of practice in many religions for the Romans, if your religion is destructive in nature, this is a religion that's not allowed in Rome. So this is very likely what his charge was against the disciples. Now, because of this, the disciples are now beaten with rods. They're sent into the inner prison where their feet were now bound in stocks. Now, this now leads us into the second conversion. Because at about midnight, the disciples are singing songs to God, they're worshiping God, and this great earthquake shakes the foundation of the prison, and all the doors and bonds are now opened and freed. And the jailer, seeing this, is about to take his own life. Because the fate for him, if all these prisoners who he was in charge of were to be freed, it would be placed back on him. So he decided to take his own life, or thought about taking his own life, to kind of spare himself from that. But at that very moment, Paul comes up and tells him that all the people are still here. Now, the jailer here probably has heard the message that they were talking about. That's the reason why they're here. And now he sees the signs that have confirmed what they've been speaking. And so he asks this question to the disciples about what he must do to be saved. And then the disciples tell him that you need to believe upon Jesus Christ to be saved. And after this, his family, he's cleaned up. The disciples are cleaned up. The family receives salvation. And at the end of the story, there is this kerfuffle between the disciples and the magistrates because they're Roman citizens. They shouldn't be treated this way. But ultimately, the disciples are released and they're allowed to go on their way. Now, this has always been a roller coaster ride for me whenever I've read this story. Right? Because the starting point sounds great. It starts on a high point, right? The first thing we do, we come into the city and people come to faith and are saved, right? Now we're at the top of the hill. We're at the top of the roller coaster. But then all of a sudden, there is this striking contrast that the entire ride just kind of flips. Everything goes sideways after this point with kind of this girl who is now mocking them, with them going before a magistrate, and now they're placed in jail. And not only are they placed in jail, but then they're prosecuted unfairly, and they're also beaten. You know, as I've come to this passage, I've often asked myself this: if this was my experience, would I have thought that the mission had failed? And maybe I misunderstood the vision that God is telling me. Have you ever had this as well, where you've actually had in your own life, where you're on this high, that something great has happened, and then suddenly there's a setback in your ministry, in your discipleship of people, in being missional, that you were excited about how things were going, and you were looking forward to seeing how it would unfold, but then the situation takes a turn and everything goes south? Is this how you felt when you read this passage of the book of Acts, that you held your breath because you're thinking, how is this mission not over? Because you're no longer free, you're now in jail. Your mission can't continue, it's done. So I think for myself, and I wonder if all of us have this same issue, is that sometimes when we hit this bump, we think that now's the end of the ministry, now's the end of this time, stop being missional, it's done, it's over. What I find most striking about this section or this passage is not so much this uphill or this downhill, but how do the disciples interact or deal with this failure, with this downward trending, it seems, of what's happening in their mission. And what amazes me is that we never get a sense that they've wavered in this calling, that they are called to be missional, to be missionaries here in Macedonia. On the contrary, as we kind of read the story, they seem to take everything in a good way. And they did everything in the best interest of God's mission. And for them, there is no obstacle that is an insurmountable wall. They only see these as temporal detours placed there by God. And even while they're in jail, their songs are not songs of lament. right? They could be singing songs like, "Oh, woe is me, how terrible is my life." Right? They could be singing songs that David has spoken about, that I'm in this rut that I can't escape, that I'm out. And yet we hear these songs of praise and worship instead, one in which they fully know and they fully trust in God. So what I've come to as I've read this passage is that these disciples were well prepared and knowing what they had signed up for in being missionaries or going to missions. Do we know what we've signed up for in missions? When we said that we've become Christians, do we know that we have also been drafted into the missionary work of God? And do we know what that's going to entail for our own lives? Jesus has so much to say to his disciples on this topic about what this missionary work is going to look like. Let me give you two examples. Matthew 10:16-18, "Behold, I am sending you as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to the courts and flog you in the synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." Again, we also see in John chapter 16, where after he's gone on this long discussion about the difficulty they're going to face, Jesus says, "These things I've spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Now, when you think of yourself living in this world, you think about our calling to be missional. And throughout the book of Acts, we've said that this calling is made to the church. Do you see that we are going to experience this kind of difficulty as we've lived in this world? Jesus and the disciples throughout the New Testament have talked about that we live in this fallen world where both spiritual and earthly forces are against us in this mission. In fact, in this account, we actually see both spiritual and earthly powers working against the disciples. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that not only will we might experience success in missional living, but we're going to have many difficulties and odd circumstances because of the world we live in. Now, this is a mindset that I think the disciples had fully bought into because how often Jesus had talked about it in his ministry life, but also as something that they've encountered throughout their own experience as Christians. And yet, even though they are going to experience this, they fully know and have signed up to it. And they accept that this is the reality that has come. What about us? I think one of the fears that we have, I think for all of us as Christians, is that grace has made us feel like we can live our lives naively. Right? Because God has saved us by grace, everything must be easy, right? Salvation seems so easy. All you got to do is believe. Right? So easy beliefs, easy life. But is that the example that we've heard from the scriptures, that our life is going to be easy? In my own life, I've met a number of different Christians who have pursued the Christian life as if there are going to be no hardships, there are going to be no difficulties, there's going to be no setbacks, and then unsurprisingly, when life hits them hard and things go sideways, their knees buckle, they're frozen in fear, and their minds turn to turmoil. If you want to get a sense of what that's like, I don't know if you guys have any fears in your life, but when I was a kid, I was terrified of heights. It was so bad at one point that basically there was a ledge that my dad was calling me to come look at. So what I did was I basically got on all fours and I military crawled all the way to the edge because I was so scared that if I got to the edge, my knees would buckle and I would fall off the cliff. And this is how I've seen in other Christians about when they hit this difficulty, it's almost like the same thing, that they get down on all fours and they got to crawl to the cliff because they're so afraid that things are so bad, that minds can't wrap around it. And many Christians are rocked because they just didn't have this expectation of difficulty in their life. And it completely overcomes them. I think as Christians, our minds should be ingrained to know that struggles and turns and challenges are all part of the Christian life, all part of the Christian call, all part of being missional. And we shouldn't be surprised when they occur. And even on a human level, I think we believe this. Let me just give you one example. So Pastor Kevin used an example from Netflix. I'm also going to use an example of a Netflix show that we watch. So me and Hannah love this show called World's Toughest Race, Eco Challenge, Fiji. So basically, this show is basically about a race where it takes over multiple days. They have to sleep through this race, but they have to run through days upon days of running this race. There's multiple checkpoints they have to hit, and they have to deal with the different elements. They have to deal with each other. They have to deal with the terrain. And ultimately, you have to get there before everyone else. This race is grueling for the best survivalists because it requires so much of you in so many different circumstances. And the one thing that we saw as we kind of watched the show, one thing that we saw that separates top teams from other teams is that the top teams knew this was going to be hard. They didn't complain, and they were focused on the task of finishing the race. And I think it's this kind of mindset that as Christians we need to crystallize ourselves to. This is the mentality that we as Christians need to go as we become more missional in the world. One point of difference I would say is that I think that we are different than the mindset of these survivalists in the show. Because for the non-Christian, the basis of this viewpoint of surviving or making it in the show is one, that I have a superior human ability to overtake these other people. And number two, there's this illusion that we control our own destinies. The basis for us to think and have this kind of mentality is that we see that our God reigns and is in control of all things. And that's a huge difference in this mentality. One is saying that I can make it because of me. The other one is saying that I can make it because of God. And this idea of God reigning is actually something that we see throughout the book of Acts, throughout this text, is that God reigning is kind of the part of the reason why they can face these challenges as they come. Let me just give you two examples of how God is sovereign over this account and over the book of Acts. Number one, we can see God's sovereignty in the salvation of people. I've said this over and over again, and I think that Pastor Kevin has made this case very clearly, that God is the driving force not only of the mission, but also in the salvation of this mission. And Luke, throughout this account, weaves in through this book and shows us that it's not us who is doing the work of salvation, but it's God who's doing the work. We see this in passages like Acts chapter 13, verse 48, where it says, "And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord, and as many as were appointed to eternal life believed." Here it places the emphasis of salvation not on their own human ability, but on those that God had elected or appointed beforehand who had come to faith. Again, we see it here in the text in Lydia, verse 14, "One who heard us was a woman named Lydia, for the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul." God is so intimately involved in this idea of salvation that as the disciples go out, they didn't see themselves as the power of what saved people, but only saw themselves as witnesses to the message of the gospel. And the one that was doing the saving was not them, it was God. So this is just one way in which we see God being sovereignly in charge of the mission that's happening, one in which they entrusted themselves in. And the message that they were entrusted with was the one in which we see that's said to the jailer, one that we saw clarification on in Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem. And this is the question: what must I do to be saved? And Paul's answer, I think, represents how we think of salvation in this church. It represents how salvation is seen in the scriptures. And that is that we need to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. The message of the gospel is something that's very simple, and certainly it did not meet the charge of what the master of the slave girl charged them with, which was introducing customs and practices that were unlawful for Romans. But what it does require of people is their trust in the saving work of Jesus Christ. This is how all of us are saved today. And this same message that the jailer receives as for salvation is the one that we as Gentiles today also receive for salvation. Another point of emphasis of how God is sovereign is not just the message of salvation or how God saves, but who is God saving? So earlier we said that here Lydia is actually pointed out, but there are actually three different people in these passages that are pointed out. The first one is Lydia. The second one is the slave girl. The third one is the jailer or a Roman soldier. Now, the way in which God saves, clearly how he saves Lydia and the Roman soldiers by salvation, but there is a freeing of this girl who has been kind of torn by a spirit, or who has been possessed by a spirit. Even she receives freedom, if not salvation. Definitely not salvation, but definitely freedom. But these are the three people that the mission is now focused on. And I think that many commentators have rightly concluded the reason that is that Luke is trying to show us something about the nature of the people that God is saving. God is not just saving those elite Gentiles who are so good and so powerful. Rather, Luke has picked people who are held lowly by Israelite standards in that day. And these are the exact people that God is now saving in this mission. That God is saving people, not just saving Gentiles by crossing gender, ethnic, and social lines in this salvation, showing that all people can and are saved. So that's the first one, which is about salvation. The second way in which we see God is sovereign over the salvation is in the events of this mission itself. As the story takes twists and turns, and it starts off well, and it goes to this downhill, and it goes ups and down, it has the ups and downs, all throughout the story, even though these things are occurring in the human level, not once do we think that God is not in control of these things, or the disciples think that God is not in control of these things. That even when things look grim and their situation they're put in doesn't look ideal, their faith is still as strong as ever. And a great example of this is actually as we see in the story of the jailer. Even though all these things have occurred, not once do they waver to think that God is not at work here. God doesn't have a plan here. They sing songs of worship and hope. And we see God at work here in the way that he does this miracle of the earthquake, releasing of the bonds, and actually bringing the jailer to faith. This is something that the jailer saw very clearly, which makes him ask the question of salvation. So this is what we see of the disciples. They are people that are unfazed by this magic carpet ride that this story took. Even though the story seems to go over sideways and under, their faith is still indomitable, and their trust in their Savior is absolute. So here's my question then, or here's the question that this now begs for us. I wonder what would happen if we changed our thinking in the same way as believers. If we stopped seeing roadblocks as something final and purposeless, or something that occurred only in its existence to bring us pain. Rather, if we saw every obstruction as an opportunity, either one where God was doing something through our misfortune or difficulty, or using these events to teach us something about himself, or to sanctify us. What if we had this kind of mindset among us if we saw everyday life like that? Would this change something for us? I think for a good number of years, this passage reminded me how it completely changed my view that for me, I'd seen this for the last couple of years, and not because I saw something magical, that there was something special in my being able to see it. No, I saw that when I was failing, when things weren't going well, God was still doing something through it over and over again. And even in times when I was frustrated and things were horrible and less than ideal, I was often humbled by what God was doing in the background. My one example here, and this is one I use quite often, is this one time I was at a retreat or part of student ministry, and at this retreat, something had happened on the first day that looked like it was going to shatter the unity of the church. Now, I'm actually not exaggerating here. This event actually was a unity-shattering event. Something was said, something happened that looked like the end of the world for this group was going to happen. We're going to be finished. At the end of 3 days, there's going to be no more. In fact, I thought people were going to leave after the first day. That's how bad things were. And I just remembered that night that as I was thinking about what was happening, I was so frustrated, I was super sweaty, and I was uneasy about this entire thing. Because the only thing that I could get through my mind is there is a very high likelihood here that this fellowship is done. That people are going to remember that something happened here, that something here was poorly handled, and they're going to not just leave this fellowship, but they actually might leave the faith altogether. And then as the night progressed, I continued to keep praying, and I just felt a sense of peace and just thinking to myself, maybe people might leave. People might stay. And I remember just telling myself that whoever God leaves us with at the end of the night, those are people we're going to be responsible for, and we're going to continue to work to build goodwill towards the people that had left. And not only after that night did nobody leave, and that the unity of that group didn't get destroyed, it actually became the basis of something that strengthened the unity of that group. It became part of the reason why the faith of that student group became so strong. And it wasn't magic. It definitely took time to sort out and questions and a lot of talking. But ultimately, so many of the people that were there that night, they were on both sides, brothers and sisters in Christ. These are people that to this day I still hold dearly, who were on both sides of that discussion. Now, this is just one example, I think, of how God uses supernatural means or these kind of ways in which he now helps us. The things that looked so terrible to begin with, he now changes for his good pleasure, for his purposes. Could it not be so much true for our own events in our own lives, the own opportunities, the own failures or issues that come up, that they're not to be used for his own good purposes? Now, I would also include in this passage that this doesn't mean that the disciples that this required nothing of them. But I would say that what it did require of the disciples, that as adversity happens, that there was a part for them to play. As we kind of read through this passage about how the disciples work through this adversity, we actually see that they do so with a lot of wisdom. They've carefully made choices throughout this text in the best interest of Christians and of the mission of God. Let me give you two examples here. Number one is it's very odd here that Paul receives this kind of beating, right? Because he's a Roman citizen. Now, very likely, they didn't even give him a chance to respond, right? Once this charge was come down, they were seen as Jewish people, definitely could not be Roman citizens, so they basically received this harsh punishment because of that. But I also think that if Paul even had the choice to come out and tell them that he was a Roman citizen, he probably wouldn't have. And my reasoning for that is because Paul has always seen himself as an example of how do we deal with difficulty and trouble in missions. And he would never want anybody to say to him, it's easy for you to talk about persecution when you can hide behind your Roman citizenship. So we actually see from Paul is he is fully willing to take on persecution because it further shows that his message is true, that he's not just speaking from something he doesn't understand, but he's actually speaking from something he knows. That's why passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2 to 5 are so powerful for us, because this is a man not of whom he has no understanding of these things, but one who is fully in the weeds, in the thick of things, on the front line. When Paul says, behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. We put no obstacle in anyone's way so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way by great endurance in affliction, hardship, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger. So here we see a man fully dedicated to this charge, using wisdom to make choices even when they're hard for him. Another example of this wisdom is at the end when he contends with the magistrates about his Roman citizenship. And the reason being is because this is probably going to be protecting future missionaries from unfair punishment, or at least it would make the magistrate think again before punishing someone without cause. So throughout this charge, we see that this mission that they're on is not one where they're just kind of like looking up the sky and like whatever happens and I don't have to do anything. No, they fully know that being wise is an important part of this mission. Maybe one last area of wisdom is how they share or seizing the opportunities to preach the gospel even through adversity. That when the jailer was ready and had asked, what must I do to be saved? They were able to give a credible witness and a credible explanation of what the gospel message is. And this brings to mind for us what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, but in your hearts honor Christ as Lord, as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have, yet do it with gentleness and respect. I think something for all of us to consider is, are there times that we are so caught up in the challenges and issues that we are facing, that we are completely blind to what God is doing in and through them to actually be effective witnesses in the world, or to take advantage of the ways in which God is calling us to grow in this world today? I guess another question for us here is, what is wisdom for you like now? Our Bible is replete with biblical wisdom of how we are to live in this world as Christians, as missionaries, as being missional living. How much are we taking of that in our own lives and using that in everyday opportunities? Being missional isn't being naive and throwing ourselves at problems. It's taking fully upon what God has given to us as wisdom and using it as we go out, as he calls us to. Now, all of this leads back to our first question that we asked earlier today. How do I deal with the adversity in our lives, especially the adversity we face in missions or missional living? Because ultimately, what we're talking about is a question of faith. Now, faith is not just this idea that I believed upon Christ one time and that's all for salvation. Faith is this everyday trusting in the hands of God, that we trust him with our lives, all things, that nothing is out of his purposes. And I think this should change the way that we think of adversity. Firstly, adversity should be something that we should expect from a fallen world. But secondly, that adversity can often just be seen as detours in our lives, that these things can also be seen to be from God. And we can have this mindset because we know that our God is sovereign. But not only that, we should also approach adversity with wisdom, knowing that what God has taught us is to be applied when his sovereign purposes are being played out. So I conclude with this. My genuine prayer for us today is that we see God always at work in our missional living, and that we act with wisdom in all circumstances. Let's pray.